1 minute 37 seconds later.
1 week later.
1 week later.
2 hours later.
2 very boring minutes later.
3 hours later. 3 weeks later.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later.
6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
6 months later. 7 hours later. 8 semesters later. 10 seconds later. 11 minutes later.
12 seconds later.
15 minutes later. 16 paranoia-filled days later.
20 minutes later.
24 hours later.
70 years later.
72 hours later. 75 years later. 82 kilometers later. 298 frozen patties later. 346 minutes later. Thousands of tears later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5,000 celebrities later.
A few inches later.
A few minutes later.
A few moments later.
A little later. A little longer than a few minutes later. A lot of boring math later. Approximately 10 hours later.
Later.
Later. Many hours later.
Many months later.
Many unbearable hours later. Moments later. More moments later. Much later. Much, much, much later. One debt to society later.
One eternity later.
One extremely annoying shift later. One frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. One little boost to the surface later. One long angry line later. One nap later. One pair of pants later. One pathetic sob story later. One season later. One semester later. One shift later. One shift later. One very long digestive tract later. One weekend of pampering later. One winner later.
Several bad puns later.
Several days later. Several song-filled hours later. Several months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Later that same evening. Late again. Later, in the void. You get the idea.
3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m. 12 o'clock midnight.
What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. By sheer coincidence.
Day 2, day 3, day 4.
Early the next morning. Flashback. End of flashback. Epilogue.
Eventually.
Graduation day. Just then. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
Meanwhile.
Montage. Opening night. Soon after. The following day.
The next day.
The next day. The very next evening. The next morning. The next morning.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure.
Yesterday.